Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I can see people entering from the waiting room, I believe. So thank you for joining us this morning. We are just waiting until about quarter past where we will get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. It's great to see people uh, participating in our Impact Symposium, our part one for 2025. It's great to welcome you. It really is. I hope everyone's having a good morning. Um, we will get started very shortly. We'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to continue joining, and we'll get started in about 1 or 2 minutes' time. Thank you. Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to this 2025 symposium. We're really delighted to be here. We'll kick off by looking at the agenda for today's session. I will share some opening remarks and then we will get started with a wonderful keynote. We're delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Stephen Hill from UKRI here today. And then we'll dive into some Q&A. We'll have time for discussion, is our hope and ambition with this, because we know it's a topic that's pertinent. And then we'll be able to dive into some reflections, hopefully share some concluding remarks, and before closing and wrapping up. Please do feel free to share your questions through the chat function in Zoom. We will be keeping an eye on it and we will keep them marked for the Q&A session in that slot that we have allocated already for us. If you had, there are a lot of attendees joining, which is wonderful, and everyone is on mute. And if you have any queries, please do feel free to message us directly as well. So hopefully everyone can hear me, see me, and see the screen sufficiently for us to get underway. Okay. So I'm Laura Tucker, and I'm the founder and CEO of Hive. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this year's 5th Impact Symposium. Whether you've joined us from the UK, Europe, or Australia, or beyond, thank you very much for making the time to be here. Over the years, the symposium has become a meaningful gathering for those working to advance the practice, strategy, and culture of research impact. We've been fortunate to welcome more than 500 participants annually, spanning senior university leaders, impact professionals, ref leads, research managers, policymakers, funders, and partners. Today continues that tradition, but with a purposeful shift. This year, for the first time, we have divided the symposium into 2 parts, and today represents part 1. So why have we shifted this focus? Well, as many of you know, our original plan was to take a broad view of impact, including strategy, practice, and assessment. However, the UK landscape has evolved considerably in recent months and has been heightened and accelerated attention on research culture, driven by the People, Culture and Environment PCE pilot under REF, as well as the ongoing engagement and insight from UKRI learned societies such as the Royal Society and funders such as the Wellcome Trust. This work has surfaced timely and important questions, such as how do we understand and define research culture? How do we evaluate and evidence it meaningfully? And crucially, how do we strengthen research cultures to create the conditions for excellent, impactful research? These are not small questions. They represent some of the most important challenges and opportunities facing research in our time. And given the concentration of recent activity around culture, we refocused the symposium to concentrate on the signals emerging from the pilot work and the sector dialogue. Today, therefore, is about exploring what do we know so far from the pilot, with a part 2 in early 2026, once the REF guidance for REF 2029 is available. So why research culture now? Well, research culture and its policy importance has grown dramatically. At its core, research culture reflects the behaviors, expectations, values, and norms that shape how research is conducted, communicated, and supported. It influences researchers' experience and well-being, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, integrity and rigor, collaboration and connectivity, innovation and engagement, and ultimately the societal impact of research. When research culture is right, people thrive. And when people thrive, excellent research with impact follows. We are living in a time of unprecedented disruption, uncertainty, and global sustainability challenges. As humans, we are being tested in ways that we're not accustomed to. Many of us are experiencing higher stress, longer working hours, and juggling increasingly complex responsibilities, according to the OECD and WHO. Universities themselves are navigating profound change, from restructuring that we've all seen and resource pressures to the erosion of public trust in public institutions. For example, we've seen how the BBC at the weekend is facing challenges in public trust amid misinformation, highlighting how even long-standing pillars of credibility can be questioned. So, in a world where information spreads rapidly, it is increasingly difficult, yet essential, to know what to believe. At the same time, our digital connectivity has never been stronger. We can join conversations with colleagues on the other side of the world instantly, like we are today. Yet this increased virtual connection can come at the cost of physical and emotional connection. Surveys of Gen Z consistently highlight high levels of loneliness and social isolation despite their digital connectivity. Yet the ability to connect authentically with other humans, to share ideas, collaborate, and build trust remains essential for our well-being, creativity, and collective progress. Technologies like AI are further reshaping the landscape. Generative AI can produce impressive outputs, but hallucinations, the generation of inaccurate or misleading information, are a real concern. There is a risk of relying on recycled content rather than fostering creativity, critical thinking, and innovation. To tackle humanity's greatest challenges, from climate change, where studies suggest we have already crossed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and even today, The Economist reported about we have to prepare for a world of 2 to 3 degrees temperature. We've missed the 1.5 target. To social inequality, we need human ingenuity, collaboration, and meaningful connections. And universities have a unique role to play here. They are beacons of hope, spaces where knowledge, creativity, and societal responsibility intersect to drive positive impact. And enabling culture within these institutions is essential, not only for research excellence, but for collective well-being, happiness, and the future quality of life. Yet we know that culture is complex and contextual. It operates at multiple levels in practice. We have individuals, teams, departments, institutional and disciplinary, and is influenced by leadership, policy, investment, and everyday habits. Understanding and strengthening this culture is critical if we want universities to thrive as environments where people can create, collaborate, and take meaningful action to improve the world we live in. This is why the REF pilot, in my view, has been so significant, because it begins to test the essential question. If culture is so central to quality and impact, how might we understand and assess it in a way that is meaningful and proportionate? So what Dr. Hill will speak to the details of the pilot and the consensus that has been emerging to assess it in terms of REF. I'd like to preempt some of the areas which I believe are interesting for further discussion following Stephen's talk as well. The new PCE evaluation signals a shift in how culture may be valued in future, not simply as an ethical or strategic aspiration, but as something that can be described, supported, and evidenced. This has significant implications for institutions. There is now recognition that culture is fundamental in research quality. Culture can be strengthened intentionally, and culture can, to some degree, be assessed. And although assessment may remain imperfect, the perfect should not be the enemy of progress. So what matters now is that we collectively build shared understanding, improve our data, learn from one another, and move the sector forward. Because research culture is not only a REF consideration, it shapes performance, supports people, and underpins future competitiveness. So why does this conversation matter to us at Hive? At Hive, we've always been passionate about impact and about enabling impact to happen. From day one, we have seen the opportunities and challenges that arise when teams and institutions work to embed impact. And we have seen how the 5 core enablers highlighted by the pilot are crucial if we are to drive systemic change and to scale impact. Across our work through our software impact tracker, advisory training, and REF assessment preparations, we've seen how leadership taking a long-term strategic view can unlock impact. We've seen how the transformative potential of new research, learning, and discovery. We've seen how understanding people's motivations clarifies their pathways to impact, and how the importance of collaboration across disciplines, sectors, and geographies. and the need for research and its benefits to be recognized and valued. When these enablers are present, impact accelerates and can scale. So while today's focus differs from our original plan, it aligns deeply with our purpose to help institutions build environments where high quality research and impact can thrive. And this is why we've also chosen to structure the symposium into two parts. So part one today on culture, and then part two early in 2026 around the guidance following the expected announcements. This enables us to respond in real time to sector needs and to return in 2026 with further insights once the guidance becomes available. So for today's session, with that context in mind, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Stephen Hill. For those who aren't familiar with Stephen Hill, he's the Director of Research at Research England, where he leads on all aspects of research policy, funding, and assessment. Formerly the Head of Research Policy at HEFKI, Stephen oversees research funding, including quality-related, i.e. QR, general capital funding, and the UK Research Partnership and the Partnership Investment Fund. He has been a leading voice in shaping UK research policy and assessment, and his leadership during the REF pilot has been instrumental in helping the sector explore new ways of understanding and evidencing research culture while preserving institutional autonomy and disciplinary diversity. Stephen also leads work on research integrity, public engagement, and open research, and contributes to national and international debates on enhancing and assessing research impact. Because we know that it's not the UK in isolation looking at this space. It really is a global movement. So today, Stephen will share key lessons from the pilot, how the emerging frameworks are developing, and what this means, and key considerations for looking forwards. We'll hear concluding reflections from, after the Q&A, we'll have time for these concluding reflections from Dr. Carlos Galán-Diaz and Dr. Laura Kemp from the Hive team, who are leading impact consultants and have worked both within UK universities and in the context of research assessments for many cycles and in different geographies. There will be time for this reflection, and we really hope that today sparks clarity, curiosity, and conversation. So we really do encourage you to use the chat for questions so we can get them noted and asked. And we hope that it helps to begin or deepen your institution's approach to strengthening research culture. So we'd like you to engage generously, share reflection, exchange ideas. We learn from each other. And thank you for being here. We are honored to be sharing this conversation with you. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Hill. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Do you need to take your... Yep. Okay. Let's do that. So hopefully you can see my slides now. So it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. This morning in the UK. I appreciate for not everyone it's morning. And thank you, Laura, for that introduction, because that's really very helpfully set the scene for what I'm going to say today. As some of you in the UK context may know, we're currently under a pausing development of the REF with announcements expected soon. And so what I want to do this morning is to focus on this question of research culture and to talk a bit about what we've been doing in the context of the REF, but also situate that more broadly in debates about research culture. And again, thank you, Laura, for those opening remarks, because I think you drew very clearly the linkage between positive and effective research cultures and generating impact. These two things are intimately linked with one another, and a positive research culture is the context within which research impact arises. And one particular aspect I would mention is the importance of cultures that are welcoming and open to the broad range of stakeholders that are needed to deliver research impact. If our research cultures are closed and unwelcoming, then it's quite hard to see how you bring in the different voices that are needed in order to generate research impact. So I think this conversation about research culture and research impact really is one conversation about how we deliver for society through the research that we do. Um, so in terms of the structure of my presentation this morning, I want to start by talking about what do we mean by research culture and how can we take our understanding of research culture and operationalize that in ways that make sense within the context of universities and other research organizations. And I think central to that has been work that's been happening over the last, 2 years or so around developing frameworks for research culture. And what those frameworks do is they take this rather high level concept of research culture and start to break it down into specific areas of focus. And I think that's central to thinking about research culture and central to taking action to improve research cultures. Um, what we've been doing in the context of the REF, which Laura has alluded to, is develop a framework for assessing research culture. We and I'll take you through the work that we've done to develop that. We think there was a need for a specific way of breaking down research culture to start thinking about how you might assess it, how you might identify excellence in research culture. And I'll talk you through the process that we used to get to that, and then this framework that we've developed as part of that. So in the course of that first part of the talk, I'm going to cover three different frameworks for research culture, which I think illustrate the different ways of thinking about research culture and breaking it down into its component parts, if you like. Then I want to move on and talk a bit about the pilot assessment itself. Because of the pause that we're on at the moment, I'm not able to give huge amounts of detail about that, but I'm happy to share some very kind of high level findings of our initial work looking at the assessment of research culture through the pilot. And in the coming weeks, what will be emerging is our kind of definitive conclusions from that work, which will be the framework for assessing people, culture, and environment in REF 2029. But I won't be able to say very much about that in the talk today. And then at the end, I just want to return to this question about what are the frameworks for research culture and start thinking about the idea of developing a consensus framework that brings together the different ways of thinking about research culture that I will have covered earlier in the presentation. So what do we mean by research culture? Well, quite a lot of people go back to a definition that was developed by the UK's Royal Society, National Academy for Sciences. And I think in Laura's remarks, she referenced some of the things in this definition. Research culture encompasses the behaviours, values, expectations, attitudes, and norms of our research community. That's kind of at the heart of the Royal Society's definition, and it determines the way research is conducted and communicated. And this definition has been hugely helpful in the developing thinking around research culture, but it's very broad and very high level, and doesn't really help us in answering the question, what do I need to do in order to make research culture better, or what are the areas that I need to look at in order to make an assessment of the research culture in a particular university or department. And that's where frameworks come in, because they start to take a definition like this and to break it down into more manageable component parts. So I want to just talk through two frameworks that have been produced in the last couple of years. One produced by Science Europe, which is a coalition of research funders in Europe, and secondly, one produced by Vitae and CRAC, who did some really interesting work on research culture in the UK context. So the Science Europe framework for research culture is a very interesting one because it's based very much on a values system. So you can see it illustrated by the infographic on the slide in front of you. Um, this defined, or the funders in Science Europe defined a number of values that they considered to be central to a productive and effective research culture. So autonomy and freedom, collaboration, integrity and ethics, equity, diversity and inclusion, openness and transparency, and care and collegiality. And the idea of this framework is that rather than focusing on this very kind of high level concept of research culture, what you need to focus on are the values that are underpinning a positive research culture. And alongside those values, they also, referenced the importance of environmental sustainability in research, so greening research, as they described it, the importance of developing new routes towards open access, and in the case of Science Europe, a preference for diamond open access. And they referenced the importance of responsible research assessment in the context of positive research cultures and the work of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, COARA. So I think this is very interesting. It gives us, real tools where we can start interrogating research culture across those values dimensions. So I think it's a really important contribution. And it also emphasizes that those values are manifest in different aspects of the research process. So research management and governance, research processes, activities themselves, and in the interaction of research with people, society, and careers. So a really helpful framing of the research culture question from Science Europe. And the second framework I want to talk about is somewhat different, and that was developed by Vitae as part of a project that they ran for UK research and innovation. Whereas the Science Europe framework, which I've talked about, is very much a top-down framework with funders considering what they deem to be the important values in the positive research culture. This framework from Vitae is much more a bottom-up framework, sourced from the activities and foci of universities in the UK whilst addressing this research culture question. So this framework came from work where Vitae sourced, through a survey, a wide range of activities that were being undertaken by universities that were being labelled as activities designed to improve research culture. And by looking at those activities and clustering them, they were able to come up with a framework. So this framework very much reflects what was going on the ground in UK universities at the point at which they did this survey. And the framework is structured into four areas: how research is managed and undertaken, how people are supported, how research ensures value, and how individuals engage with one another. This framework, I think, is really interesting and useful from the practical point of view of saying what are the types of activities or interventions that are needed to improve research culture. And essentially those bullet points beneath the four areas give you, areas that are foci for interventions to improve research culture. What's interesting for this audience, I think, is how the value that comes from research is really foregrounded in this framework as being a central part of research culture. So under that how research ensures value element, then there are a number of things, but taking an open approach to research, communicating research, and realizing impact are clearly identified as important parts of research culture. So I think in the context of research impact, I think this framework, which, as I say, is derived from the activities that people are actually doing, is a very strong validation of the linkage between research culture and impact. And I think both of these frameworks, the Science Europe framework and this framework that's on the screen at the moment, really help us to identify the key facets of research culture and design interventions to think about how we might change research culture. But there's a question about how effective either of those frameworks could be in terms of making an assessment of research culture, which is less about designing interventions and more about measuring the change that comes from those interventions. So these frameworks really form a kind of starting point for the thinking we were doing around research culture in the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, our National Research Assessment. So I'm going to move on to the REF now, but conscious that this is an international audience, I just want to very briefly introduce the REF to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about. So the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework, is our national research evaluation in the UK. It's conducted periodically every 7 or 8 years, and it's owned and led by the four national higher education funding bodies within the UK. So that's the Department for Economy in Northern Ireland, MEDA, who are the Commission for Tertiary Education and Research in Wales, Research England, my organisation, and the Scottish Funding Council. And it's a big and important exercise. It informs allocation of around £2 billion worth of block grant funding to universities each year, is important for providing accountability for public investment. And over its almost 40-year history, research evaluation in the UK has evolved, responding to changes in the research base and the way we're thinking about research, and the move towards looking at research culture more in REF is part of that evolution. Because the REF determines quite significant allocation of funds, research funds to universities, it inevitably drives behaviour. And so I think it is on us that operate the REF to ensure that those behavioural incentives are aligned in the right direction. And that's very much where our focus on research culture comes from. Next exercise will be concluded in 2029, and as Laura has already said, we're in the midst of preparations for that exercise now. The overall structure of the exercise, as initially announced, looks like this. We have 3 elements that we're looking at: engagement and impact, and contribution to knowledge and understanding. I'm not going to talk about today. But today's focus is on the people, culture, and environment element, and this builds on previous exercises that had research environment as an assessment, and it really is an evolution of that research environment to take into account some of these broader issues about research culture, and we'll be evidencing that based on likely to be both institution level and disciplinary level, unit level, and evidence statements explaining and evidencing progress and practice in research culture. But this extension to research culture was a new element, a new departure for us in the exercise. So as a result of that, we did quite a lot of work to build an infrastructure that would allow us to assess research culture. So this formed really 2 distinct pieces of work that followed on from one another. The first was a piece of work to develop indicators for positive research cultures. So as I said when I was talking about the frameworks, those frameworks provide very good structure in which to design interventions from research culture. But what we're interested in assessment is how we measure the outcomes of those interventions. And that needs either quantitative or qualitative indicators to help us to do that. And that was the reason we developed a set of indicators. So the process we went through to do that was one very much of consultation. We worked with Technopolis and Crack Vitae, who did this work for us. They developed a range of indicators of research culture, and then through a consultative process of workshopping and survey, hone that down to a short list of indicators for research assessment to be tested through a pilot assessment. And in the course of that, we engaged with quite a large number of people from the higher education system in the UK through 4 scoping workshops, 10 deep dive workshops, and an open survey that was open to anyone to contribute. So out of that emerged this short list of indicators. It was called a short list because it was shorter than the list that we started on, although there was still a large number of indicators, and that needed to be fed into this pilot process that we've been running in order to hone that down to the indicators that were really practical to deliver through the exercise. So as I say, we called it a short list, but for many people it looked like quite a long list. We're in the process now of honing that down into a much tighter set of indicators based on the findings from the pilot. So as part of developing the pilot, and once we had those indicators in hand, we thought it was really important to have a framework for research culture against which we were assessing. And this is the framework that we developed based on the outcomes of that indicators work. So we identified 5 enablers of a positive research culture that are listed on this slide: strategy, responsibility, connectivity, inclusivity, and development. And I hope you can see there is some correspondence to the frameworks that I've been talking about before. So this didn't just come out of the air. It was an evolution from the work that had been done previously. Under strategy, we were interested in people's vision for research culture, evidence around their evaluation approaches, continuous learning, and reflection. Under responsibility, this was about research integrity and social responsibility in research. Connectivity, wide sharing, collaboration, and open research. Inclusivity is about tackling inequalities, valuing diversity, addressing discrimination and harassment, and so on. And then development was really about people development, how people are supported through their careers, pathways and progression routes, and development opportunities. So these 5 enablers were the structure that we took into the pilot exercise, both testing the indicators that fitted underneath each of these 5 enablers, and also testing the framework itself, testing whether the enablers were the right ones for an assessment. So to do that, we carried out this pilot exercise, which has been running over the past 12 months or so. This took a sample of universities from the UK, 40 universities representing a range of types of university, and just 8 units of assessment, so 8 disciplinary areas. We have 34 disciplinary areas for the full ref. So this was just again a sample which enabled us to run a pilot. The universities produced submissions based around the framework and indicators around this time last year, and those were assessed by pilot panels that we established during the course of 2025. And we're at the stage now, as I say, of finalising the guidance around people, culture, and environment, and that will be published later this year. Key questions for the pilot were which indicators work or don't work. It's very easy to come up with indicators, but when you're actually trying to use them in reality, it's not always as straightforward. So we were interested in which indicators work, which gave valuable information for assessment, which were deliverable by universities. It was a key part of the pilot. Allied to that, we were interested in how burdensome this was for universities to do. So we were some indicators were already collected and very easy to present in an assessment context. Others required additional work and created burdens. And we were also very interested in whether there were any unintended consequences for using a particular indicator. How would that drive behaviour, and would it potentially drive behaviour in a negative way? So the pilot is concluded. We're in the process of bringing together those lessons to inform policy announcements. But what I want to do in the next few minutes is just give you a very kind of high level flavour of the lessons that we're taking out of the PCE pilot. The first one, an important one that we were able to through the pilot, demonstrate that excellence in research culture can be identified and assessed. So this was a key question for us as going into the pilot. And the conclusion that came out was definitely excellence could be assessed. Important words in italics, though, in that first bullet point on this slide is in aspects of. So not all of the indicators or not all of the aspects of research culture we were looking at were as easy to identify and assess, and that was really valuable information from the pilot that will feed into policy. Key lesson was that context matters in research culture assessment. So you need to understand the context that a university is operating in order to understand how it's doing in terms of research culture. And we have a lot of institutional diversity within the UK system, and we need to take that into account in assessing research culture. Perhaps not surprisingly, we discovered through the pilot that there are data and evidence limitations. So as I was saying earlier, some of the indicators, it turned out, was very difficult to get data on. We didn't have data, wasn't necessarily being collected. And this will very much inform what can and can't be done in the full assessment. The pilot really confirmed what we had, an assumption we'd gone into it with, which was that you need to look at both the whole institution and the department or unit of assessment level in making an assessment of research culture. So it's not good enough to do one or the other. You do need to do both. And one of the things that we're very actively considering is what the relative weighting of those different parts of the assessment should be. And from the pilot, we're able to shape a set of core, or we're in the process of shaping a set of core indicators and evidence. As I said, not everything that went into the pilot worked out, and even if it had all worked out, it would have been way too much anyway. So we definitely need to hone this down to a much smaller set of indicators and evidence requirements, which is the work that's ongoing. Just going back to the framework, what did we learn about the framework in the pilot? I think we learned various things that I can just illustrate on this slide. So when talking about strategy for research culture, we think it's quite, or the findings of the pilot was it's quite hard to assess that without seeing that in the context of the overall strategy of the institution or the unit for research. So research culture needs to be embedded in research strategy overall and not as a separate add-on. And that was a slight artifact of the pilot because we were just focusing on this aspect, but it's a very clear finding that came through. When you look in the responsibility enabler around research integrity and social responsibility, there was a feeling that from the pilot that quite a lot of the things in this area were really baseline requirements that every university should be achieving, not things that we would be assessing on a scale. So that is an important finding. We found that there was some overlap between enablers. This didn't come as a surprise to us, particularly because we knew in developing the framework that it was difficult to draw clear boundaries between these areas. So open research, for example, cuts across into the responsibility and integrity enabler as well as being part of connectivity. Again, looking at the inclusivity enabler, it was felt that a lot of the things in here were baseline requirements. Obviously, in the UK context, we have legal requirements around diversity that are non-negotiable, so there was a feeling that were some aspects of inclusivity really were baseline requirements rather than things that you might be assessing against on a scale. There was a strong steer from the pilot panels that we needed to make sure that research diversity was included in the inclusivity enabler. So that is, what do universities and research departments do to make sure that different types of research are appropriately valued? And that wasn't in the original framework and came out as a potential addition. And some of the challenges around the development enabler was around how do you define the research community. If you're measuring performance around career support for whom is a really important and potentially challenging part of this. So that's key learning that we'll be taking forward. So, having given you a bit of a flavour of the pilot and the findings from the pilot, I just want to go back to this question of uh, of research culture frameworks. And the question about whether we can or should be developing some sort of consensus framework. And I introduced the Science Europe framework, which is on the bottom of this slide, which is very values based. The research culture framework from Vitae, which is much more based on activities and a bottom up, which evolved into or was used as a developer for the 5 enablers of a positive research culture that we used in the PC pilot. So, what are the consensus items that come out of this? And I think this is a really useful conversation to be having as we start thinking about both assessing research culture and doing work to enable and enhance positive research cultures. This needs a longer conversation with the research community about developing these consensus frameworks. But I thought it might be interesting to see what would come out of an AI-driven combination of these existing frameworks. So, this is just an initial experiment to try and see what this means. But these frameworks were fed into to large language model, and the large language model was given the task of producing a consensus framework for research culture that drew on these. And this is the unedited, what I'm about to show you is the unedited output of that large language model process. So it's not had any kind of finessing or nuancing, but I think it does it is quite interesting. It illustrates, I think, where we're heading in terms of the consensus around what a positive research culture is about. And this is the consensus framework that emerges from that process. There are 5 elements to it: leadership and strategy, research excellence, impact and value, people and careers, and collaboration and connectivity. And you can see the echoes of the inputs in this consensus framework, and I think it does provide a kind of very useful framework. Although I might observe that really what this is talking about now is a framework for research strategy, and actually it's really embedding, really emphasizing the fact that a good research culture and a positive way of approaching research are actually the same thing, and they are, we're separating them from the point of view of thinking about assessment, but actually these are the things that we need to focus on to deliver quality research and positive outcomes for society. So I think that's an interesting experiment. I'm not saying it's definitive or perfect, but I think it shows us that the frameworks we're developing are converging on something that really is makes sense in the context of research excellence. So to conclude, then, I think I've hopefully convinced you that frameworks are helpful tools for considering research culture. They do help us break down this kind of very high level concept into something more manageable. I think the learning from the pilot is summarized that the assessment of research culture is definitely possible. And when we went into the pilot, there were definitely people who believed that wasn't the case. But there are data and evidence gaps, and we need to be realistic about those. And some aspects of research culture are easier to assess than others. And I think we're heading to a point where there is a consensus framework emerging around research culture. This is a useful tool, I think, for international conversations about research culture. And I think we're in a strong position now to further enhance and improve our research cultures, which, going right back to Laura's opening remarks, is what we need to do if we want to deliver maximum benefit from research. So thank you very much for your attention. Happy to take questions about any or all of that. And I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone who have joined today for this symposium. Interesting thoughts on the PCE, Stephen. For those who are new to this, hopefully you've got a nice flavor of what the PCE entails and this beautiful assessment, the REF. We have a few questions already in the Q&A, Stephen. I'll start with those ones, but people are encouraged to just ask some more or possibly raise your hand, and if we have time, we can go to you. The first question we have, Stephen, is from Grace, and she asks, how does the finding that research diversity needs to be assessed fit with the narrative from funders and government that we need to specialize? A very topical question. Thank you, Grace. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. It's a good question. I think what I was meaning by research diversity in the context of those slides was diversity of types of research. So approaches to research, ways of conducting research, different ways of communicating research. So diversity in research outputs, which is also very important. So that was the focus of the finding from PCE, was that type of diversity needs to be reflected in any treatment of inclusivity. So that was the pilot finding. But I think you raise also an interesting question about diversity in topic of research and the relationship between that and, in the UK context, the recent white paper, which the government is calling for more specialisation in research. And I think the way to reconcile that is that whereas we need to continue to have, in my view, at a national level in the UK, diversity of topic of research. So, we need to cover a wide range of topics. We need perhaps to think about at the individual institution, university level, whether more focus on particular strengths is the way to deliver the best outcomes. And I think that's how you reconcile this kind of diversity and specialization point. Specialization is about what institutions do, diversity about more about at the national level. But to preempt a question, I think that does raise a challenge because universities as autonomous organizations make their individual choices about which areas to focus on, if any. And so you do have a risk that if everybody makes a decision to specialize away from a particular discipline, you could lose that at national level. And I think that's a challenge that we're certainly in researching and we're very alive to. And we need to think about ways of tackling that.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll go for another question from the Q&A. And this is an interesting one because I think everyone is always concerned about how we're going to allocate funds from the results of these assessments. So Jen asks, when you boil this down to REF scores and therefore QR allocation, is she understanding correctly that the institution will be assessed, each UA will be assessed, and then the UA score will be a combination of those two with some weighting, but not necessarily 50-50. So a PCE score could be brought up or down depending on how well the institution is assessed, Stephen?
So there are lots of options. So when it comes to funding, it's for the individual funding bodies in the four nations to decide how they use the results. So I think what's underpinning your question is definitely a way of thinking about it. There are other ways. We could only publish institution level and unit level profiles, not have any combined weighting in the ref, and then leave it up to the individual funding bodies to decide how they handle that. In the complexities of the funding formula, you could just use the institution score, an institution level driver, and the unit score, a unit level driver. So there are lots of options. We will be saying more about this in announcements later in the year, but there are lots of options in handling that institution level versus unit level score.
Thank you, Stephen. And Jen, yeah, keep your eyes on the developments, because there are always permutations that can be advantageous or can be challenging. I have a technical question, Stephen, and I think this is important because, as we know, the ref is a potential research avenue as well, the meta research on what we do. So this anonymous attendee asks us, what large language did you use, model, sorry, and will you be sharing the prompts used when you publish the pilot report?
So that work is not part of the pilot at all. That's just me experimenting with seeing whether we could get anything interesting out of the combining these different frameworks. So it's not kind of official work, and it's not influencing or anything to do with the ref. It was Google Gemini was the model that was used. I'm sure you would have got very similar results using any of the other models. And then in terms of the PC pilot, the kind of official thing of which that work using large language models was not part, but the PC pilot report will be published alongside the policy announcements later in the year.
Thank you, Stephen. And again, I think we can encourage our research community to get on board and see if there are clever ways of testing some of these things. And there is a plethora of evidence out there already of people trying to help us evaluate in a more succinct way. The next question, Stephen, is a very interesting one that brings us back to the heart of the PCE and probably the beginning of the discussions. But I think it's an important one, and I would welcome your thoughts for the community. Another anonymous attendee says they were interested in hearing that there is a feeling that measuring baseline or standards, which should have been met already by law or policy, cannot be done. Is it not a useful exercise to test whether and how laws and policies are enacted in practice?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I wasn't suggesting that that those things that might be viewed as baselines wouldn't necessarily be part of the assessment, but I think they're not useful in terms of producing a kind of relative score. So, you're either meeting baseline requirements or you're not. So, it doesn't help in terms of kind of grading across the 4-star levels that we use in the ref and so on. There are different ways in which you can assess those baseline requirements. So we already have in Research England's funding terms and conditions some of those things that you might call baseline requirements. So, for example, completing the requirements of the Research Integrity Concordat is a condition of our funding already, and we're exploring, and we announced earlier in the autumn that we're exploring whether we can strengthen and enhance that element of our terms and conditions to focus on some of these baseline requirements. So I think the conclusion from the pilot was that those types of things aren't very useful in making an assessment of excellence in research culture, but that's not to say they're not super important, and that people should be held to account that they're achieving those baseline standards.
Thank you, Stephen. Of course, this is always an opportunity to push boundaries a little bit, Stephen. So the next one is doing exactly that. Given the data and evidence gaps, as well as the financial challenges facing the sector, there may be valid reasons to not go full PCE in REF 2029, not 2021. Are the funding bodies looking forward to changes that can be made for the following REF? If you can share some ideas about that, that would be useful, Stephen. Thank you.
Yeah, I think well, we're always, always looking forward to the future and work in earnest to start thinking about what happens after F 2029 will kick off quite soon. That's the nature of the process. Um, I think one of the conclusions from the pilot is that there are indicators of research culture that would be helpful in assessment, but are not really feasible currently because the data that's required is not routinely collected. So it would be very hard. It would be a lot of effort to collect it, and it would also involve retrospectively collecting data, which is particularly hard and not good practice, really. So I think there are things that emerge from the pilot that are certainly in the category of useful in the long term, but not usable in the short term. And so I think those types of things, will be on the potentially for use in subsequent assessments, depending on the nature of those assessments. So, I think we are at quite an interesting time in terms of the future of research assessment. And it's an open question as to whether future research assessments will look like REF type assessments or whether they'll look rather different. And that's not me saying it's going to be different in the future. It's just saying we need to be open to that option. But I think in terms of PCE, there are definitely things that come out of the pilot that are not usable in the current RAM, but might be useful in the future. So yes, I think that's right.
Thank you, Stephen. Another question brings us back to the essence again, and I think it's worth rehearsing it a little bit because we have guests from all over the world and also people who may not have REF experience. But Rachel asks, there are a variety of concordats and initiatives in the UK. Could you reflect on how these might dovetail with the assessment and baseline? So a related question, but I think a really important one, given that they're not all up to date and there are different institutional contexts. So now with the advancement of the work that you've been doing, where are we roughly with regards to these?
Yeah, I think the concordats that exist are an important part of this landscape, and they do give us really valuable frameworks for thinking about aspects of research culture. What the risk is that they could become just kind of compliance tools without people really thinking through what change needs to happen. But I think the concordats are an important part of it, and I think the point you make, Rachel, about not all concordats fitting all types of institution is a really important one. So I think what we're keen to do is, rather than just say, you need to do this concordat, is to say the aims of this concordat are important, and you can do that through implementing the concordat directly or through other more institutionally appropriate ways of addressing that. And I think the open data, I think in your question you mentioned the open data concordat. Clearly what is meant by open data is very different in different institutions. So in an art specialist, for example, that might mean something very different from in a STEM-based institution. So yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge context, and that was one of the key findings that came out of the pilot too.
Thank you, Stephen. Everyone, we have approximately another 10 minutes of questions because Stephen has to leave us for 10:30 sharp. So I'll take a few more questions, Stephen, if that's okay with you. Philly asks us another lovely question that has been around for a while, but I think it's still very poignant and worth rehearsing. Uh, Philly says, you mentioned looking at department level research culture as well as institutional level research culture. This works well for large higher education institutions, but how will this work for small universities where research culture between the two levels are harder to separate, especially in higher education institutions that are highly interdisciplinary?
Yeah, and this is back to the context. Context matters, and the situation different for different institutions. I think the kind of principle that we think is important in terms of this institution level versus unit level split is we don't want duplication across those. So we want a kind of clear dividing line about what's covered at the institutional level and what's covered at the unit level. And I think what's important is to make sure there is sufficient flexibility in the system that allows us to accommodate, both large multi-faculty institutions at the one hand, um, to small specialist institutions that might only be making a submission in one or two units of assessment at the other. So I think what we're heading for is some flexibility. I think it's interesting that you say in your question that this will work well for large institutions and it's a challenge for smaller ones. I've had the opposite viewpoint expressed as well, that it's really difficult for large institutions to do the institution level statement because they have so much diversity in their range of UOAs. So it's challenging. Potentially there are challenges for everyone, but flexibility is what matters, and I hope we'll end up with a framework that gives that.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to jump the order and go to Jean Mallon question, because I think it brings up something that has also been discussed for quite some time. And Jean asks, in terms of the health and well-being of researchers themselves and or those that support them, has any work gone into exploring their lived working experience in a way that is making its way into the PCE culture framework via the pilot or any other mechanism? Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. So a number of universities carry out surveys of their staff in the context of research culture. So that's already an extant practice. And I think those surveys provide a source of evidence that those universities can play into their PCE submissions if they wish to. And there are also, of course, national surveys like CEDARS and the postgraduate student experience survey and so on, that not every university takes part in, but a range of universities. It's not just bespoke to individual universities. It's more national and structured. So all of those things are helpful sources of evidence that do get at this question of what is the experience of being a researcher in this university like, and that is a source of evidence. So I think that will be valuable for those institutions that do it. But having said all that, we're not in the business of constructing a national researcher experience survey that everybody has to complete and is a mandatory part of research assessment. And the reason for that is that I think these things need to be tailored to local conditions. And obviously, some people are happy to take things off the shelf like the CEDAR survey and use them, but others want more bespoke and focused. And I think that's exactly the right way to go if that's right for the institution. So I think the experience of researchers on the ground is important. We would expect it to see it feature in evidence, but how that evidence is gathered, I think, is down to individual institutions.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll take now a question from the general chat from Bridget that also brings a nice challenge for you, Stephen. Could a consensus framework create an artificial in or out attitude narrowing both the definition and the support for researchers?
Yes, is the short answer to that question. I think one of the challenges in assessing research culture more broadly is to avoid the kind of idea that everywhere needs to look the same, that there is one kind of perfect research culture that everyone is aspiring to. Whereas I tend to think of it much more as that there are a family of good, positive, healthy research cultures, but there is variation between them. So any framework that we have that is applied in a very kind of narrow way of saying, every bit of this framework is equally important and everybody has to achieve it, is problematic. So yes, I think it's really important that we maintain diversity of institutions and accept that there are it's research cultures plural, not research culture singular, that we're aiming for. And there's a lot of debate and discussion in the pilot amongst the panels about the concept of distance traveled in terms of research culture assessment. So is it about assessing absolute performance in aspects of research culture, or is it about assessing improvements in research culture? And I think that's a live debate, which is very relevant to this question of whether everyone should look the same and whether good looks the same in every context.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to take another anonymous question because I think it is important to reflect on our experience to date and for you to share with the community a couple of your thoughts on this. How do we ensure that the PCE component ensures meaningful commitments to positive research cultures and doesn't turn into a tick box exercise for the institutions?
Yeah, it's a challenge. But I think the slightly glib answer is by designing a framework that is effective, which is what we're trying to do. But I realize that's not particularly satisfactory answer. I think the point about lived experience and evidence of lived experience is quite important around that. So it's very good to say you have frameworks and approaches to things, but if it doesn't actually reflect people's perceptions of what's happening on the ground, then they're not working as effectively. So I think the answer is we need a combination of policy and practice and evidence of change or positive outcomes that need to be combined together. And I think that's very much the direction we're going in.
Thank you, Stephen. And there are a number of questions in the Q&A that make points towards this. How do we see positive outcomes? What does it look like when you have a positive outcome in a university setting, and how do you enable these ones? Could you give us your personal take on what the sector will look like once we implement some of these ideas and we see the results? What do we expect to see? What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
Yeah. Well, I suppose one reflection is that the focus on research culture from all sorts of angles over the last number of years, and the Royal Society work was very early in this, combined with the proposals that we have for the REF, have already led, I think, to substantial change, at least in the sense that there is now much more activity and focus on questions of research culture within institutions. There are roles, academic roles, often deans or associate pro vice chancellors for research culture. So those now exist in a number of universities that didn't exist even 3 years ago. So that change has already happened. There are teams in professional services now that are focused on research culture. So there's a national network of professional services staff who work on research culture. All of those things have happened in the last few years as a result of this increased focus on research culture. So I suppose my first reflection to your question is there's a lot of change that's already happened, and that's positive and good. Um, I suppose in terms of outcomes, then as we move through the ref assessment and this kind of trend continues, um, what we would hope to see is a kind of change in the perceptions of research culture within the context. So many people will remember the survey that the Wellcome Trust commissioned a number of years ago, which I think was a bit of a wake-up call to a lot of people about the poor research cultures in some parts of our education system. And I would, like to think that if that survey were rerun in 3 years' time, then we would see a change and improvement. Having said that, of course, there are broader contextual factors at play that will also influence that outcome. But I think, I would say we've seen real evidence of change and an increased focus on some of these issues.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. We have 3 minutes left before your departure, so I'll bring in Laura, our CEO at Hive, just to thank you for your contribution, Stephen. I think that it's been a very, very refreshing Q&A session, and personally, I've enjoyed it, and I thank your honesty and your generosity with the audience. Laura.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, for your time and for just to add on to what Carlos was sharing. It's always wonderful to learn and to hear from your experience and your reflections about how the process is continuing. We look forward to hearing how things progress over the next months and what is shared before the end of the year. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your questions. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I have to leave before the end of the event, but I do have somewhere else I need to be. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. And I'd like to pass over to Laura and Carlos.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Stephen, who's not here anymore, but for giving us quite a good steer on what we can expect and for answering so many questions with care. I think that it seems positive that the frameworks and the indicators will be fairly holistic and focused on diversity for both research and researchers and the people that support it. But also that impact and universities' roles in society and their civic roles will be integral to the assessment of research culture. And I think what we've learned is that research culture can be assessed, but it will need care and effort, and I think some level of flexibility over what is appropriate evidence. And we're all waiting keenly to really hear what those data gaps will be. And context, as Stephen said, is really important due to the wide range of institutional diversity we have in the UK. So it's reassuring that this will be taken into account. And also for Hive, very reassuring to hear that impact is going to be so integral to this assessment of research culture.
Thank you.
Sorry, over to you, Carlos. What are your reflections?
Well, I think we live in very exciting times with these developments. I think the sector has done a fantastic job of getting together and being vocal about the things that matter. I think there is a lot of reflection from the work in the pilot and the REF guidelines in general to listen to those who put in the hard work, and that is refreshing. I think we're going to get something that goes to some extent to meet those needs that we have in the sector. I think from our experience, we have seen a huge deal of progress in how people conceive the impact frameworks, and more recently, their environment as enablers of excellent research with impact in mind. And that can only be a good thing for the sector. And of course, that doesn't negate the challenges we have and the different disruptors that Laura Tucker mentioned earlier on. We live in very, very difficult times at the moment, funding-wise, politically, and this is an opportunity we have to truly shine in our institutions and in the sector for what we do well. I think there is not much more to say in terms of the presentation. I think all of the questions were answered. For the couple of people who made questions about weightings, I encourage you to go back to the guidance. It's still not out there, as Stephen said, but you can rehearse it on the Ref 2021, which is the latest one we have from the UK. There are permutations and there are ways of future-proofing yourselves if one of your components is not as good as it should be for what you need it to be. But I think that the ref is a driver of behavior to answer another one of the questions, and there are ways of implementing these measures so that the culture, the research culture, and the well-being of your researchers is looked after and possibly increase and create a better environment for everyone. I think those are my concluding thoughts, Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll hand back to you now, Laura. Thank you everyone for coming today. We hope this has been useful.
Thank you. So to conclude with our to close off this part one, as we draw this part one of the 5th Impact Symposium to a close. So thank you, Laura and Carlos, for sharing your reflections. Just wanted to take a moment to consider what we've explored today and what it tells us about research culture, both where we are, where we might be going next. I think today has really reminded us how central research culture is to research itself. It shapes how we work, how we collaborate, how we support each other, and ultimately the impact we can achieve, which is crucial, I guess, part of the motivation of why we're here from our perspective. It really stretches from leadership to strategy to people, careers, and collaboration and connectivity and impact. These enablers are not abstract ideas, they're lived experiences present in the way teams function, our day to day. And what we can do here is enable the researchers and to thrive and institutions to grow. We've seen that culture is complex, it's contextual, it shifts across teams, departments, and disciplines, and it's influenced by leadership, policy, resources, and daily habits. And yet, despite this complexity, there is enormous opportunity, as Carlos just touched on. And what we heard from Stephen just then, the recent sector pilot work and the sector dialogue gives us a glimpse of what might be possible. And in terms of ways to understand evidence and strengthen culture, so it supports both people and research outcomes. And we really clearly got a clear sense of that from what was just shared earlier. Looking ahead, from our side, our focus will be on supporting institutions to prepare for assessment. So we'll wait to see what happens with the guidelines later this year. And from our work with universities, we've really seen consistent patterns that make a real difference. So firstly, thinking about capturing what matters. And this idea and the role of evidence has come up repeatedly today. So when we take time to understand what matters most to researchers, teams, and institutions, we start to see the levers that shape culture. This might include evidence of collaboration, mentorship, engagement with communities, or the tangible impact of research. Collecting and reflecting of this kind of evidence as well helps institutions gain clarity on their strengths and identify where to focus their efforts. Secondly, think about reflecting and improving. There is time, and so structured reflection, whether through case studies, reviews, or facilitated discussions, helps teams to understand priorities, identify gaps, and chart a pathway forward. It highlights opportunities to scale or amplify existing successes and improve overall performance, turning insight into action. And when we think about, thirdly, supporting people and teams, cultures thrive when people, what we've seen is how cultures thrive when people feel supported, recognized, and connected. Our experience shows that when leaders take a long-term view, teams are motivated and collaboration is encouraged, and the conditions for impact naturally flow. There is a level of security there. And when researchers feel valued, they can focus on excellence, and institutions benefit from stronger outcomes and engagement. So as we looking towards REF 29 and beyond, we see that institutions, we know we're preparing for a REF 2029 and future assessments, as we've done for the last few rounds already. This is no different in that sense. But the challenge will be embedding this culture strengthening practices that are authentic, sustainable, and tailored to each context, as we heard about today and in the Q&A. So we see an opportunity to combine evidence, reflection, and sector insight to make culture visible and actionable. Institutions that engage with their people collect meaningful evidence and create reflective spaces, then incorporate these insights into realistic strategies, are best positioned to strengthen culture in a genuine, lasting way. So when we think about building collective, lasting and collective change, finally, and from our experience, meaningful change comes from collective effort. No single team or leader can shape culture alone. Collaboration across teams, departments, and institutions is key to driving sustainable change. We want to creating environments where researchers thrive, collaboration flourishes, and impactful research can scale. And so as we wrap up today, I want to share 3 reflections. Firstly is around how clarity matters, understanding what drives research culture and the conditions under which people and teams flourish, helps us to make better decisions about where to focus energy and attention. Second, curiosity is essential. Asking questions, experimenting, and exploring what might work in your own context. There's no single model for excellence, but curiosity opens the door to insight and improvement. And thirdly, connection makes a difference. Sharing experiences across teams, faculties, and institutions creates a community of learning that amplifies what each of us can achieve individually. And this sector is good at generally sharing and learning between ourselves. And that reflection is really crucial from a learning and something that we see done successfully in other sectors and spaces as well. So thank you everyone for your openness and for your engagement and contributions through the chat today. We are very grateful for that participation, and we want to revisit, it really helps make this symposium meaningful from our side, and we're really excited to look at part 2 in early 2026, where we'll pick up these conversations in light of REF guidance and further sector developments that we're expecting. But until then, let's continue learning, experimenting, and supporting each other, and building environments where researchers, teams, and institutions can truly thrive. So thank you very much for joining. We have shared a feedback survey into the chat box, and there is a QR code now available on the screen. We would love your feedback and comments for the symposium. We are in our 5th year of running this, and as we shared, this year is part 1, and we will be preparing for part 2. So please do share your comments and feedback. It will be much appreciated. And we look forward to welcoming you in part 2 in early 2026. So thank you and goodbye.